The pilot collapsed at 30,000 feet. His heart had stopped. 200 passengers were about to die. The co-pilot was screaming for help. And the only person who could save them was sleeping peacefully in row 8. Nobody knew who she really was. Nobody knew what she could do. Until now. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The woman in row 8 looked completely ordinary, wrapped in a thin gray blanket with a neck pillow supporting her head as she slept peacefully against the window. Nobody on Flight 447 gave her a second glance as they walked past her seat, boarding the early morning flight from Denver to Chicago. She had her eyes closed before most passengers even found their seats, and within minutes of settling in, she appeared to be in a deep, undisturbed sleep that suggested she desperately needed the rest. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, though nobody around her knew that or cared to know it. To the flight attendants preparing for departure, she was just another tired passenger who wanted to sleep through the 2-hour flight. To the businessmen who squeezed past her to reach the window seat, she was someone who had probably worked too many late nights and finally had a chance to catch up on rest. To the young mother in row 7 who quietly told her children to use their inside voices, she was a stranger who deserved courtesy and quiet so she could sleep in peace. What none of them knew, what nobody on that Boeing 737 could possibly have guessed by looking at the sleeping woman in the navy blue sweater and comfortable jeans, was that Sarah Mitchell had more flying experience than both pilots in the cockpit combined. She had spent 22 years as a commercial airline captain, flying the exact same type of aircraft they were sitting in right now. Before that, she had been a military cargo pilot, flying transport planes into active war zones where one wrong move could mean death for everyone on board. She had logged over 20,000 flight hours, survived 3 engine failures, landed in weather conditions that would terrify most pilots, and spent the last 3 years as a senior flight instructor teaching emergency procedures to pilots who thought they had seen everything until Sarah showed them what real emergencies looked like in the simulator. Her hands had guided planes through situations that ended careers for less skilled pilots, and her calm decision-making under pressure had saved lives more times than she could count. But today, she was just a passenger who wanted to sleep. Sarah had deliberately not mentioned her background to anyone at the airport or on the plane because she wanted this flight to be different from her usual travels. She wanted to be invisible, to not have flight attendants asking her questions about turbulence or passengers wanting to hear stories about near disasters she had survived. She had taken a few days off to visit her sister in Denver, and now she was heading home to Chicago where her only plans were to relax, catch up on paperwork, and maybe take her nephew to the Science Museum like she had promised months ago. So when she boarded Flight 447 and found her seat in row 8, she had closed her eyes and let the familiar sounds of an aircraft preparing for departure wash over her like a lullaby. The clicking of overhead bins, the rustle of passengers settling in, the flight attendants going through their safety demonstration that she could recite from memory, all of it faded into background noise as she drifted into sleep. The flight attendants, a cheerful woman named Jessica and a professional young man named Marcus, noticed the sleeping passenger in 8C and made a mental note to skip her during beverage service unless she woke up on her own. Jessica whispered to Marcus that some people just really needed their sleep, and they both smiled at how peaceful the woman looked, completely unaware of the activity happening all around her. They had no way of knowing that this sleeping passenger could fly the plane better than most of their regular pilots, or that in less than an hour, her hidden expertise would become the only thing standing between everyone on board and a catastrophic disaster that would test the limits of human skill and courage. Captain William Reynolds was running through his pre-flight checklist in the cockpit, his movements practiced and efficient after 31 years of flying commercial aircraft. At 58 years old, he was one of the airline's most experienced captains, known for his steady hands and calm demeanor even in difficult situations. His record was spotless, his passengers always arrived safely, and younger pilots respected him as someone who had truly mastered the art of flying. Sitting beside him in the co-pilot seat was First Officer David Park, a sharp 32-year-old pilot who had been flying for the airline for 6 years and was working toward his own captain upgrade. Together, they made an excellent team, professional and thorough, the kind of crew that passengers never worried about because everything always went smoothly when they were in charge. The morning sky was clear and beautiful as Flight 447 pushed back from Gate 23 right on schedule at 7:15. The engines powered up with their familiar roar, and Captain Reynolds guided the aircraft toward the runway where they joined a short line of planes waiting for takeoff clearance. Sarah remained completely asleep in row 8, her breathing slow and steady, her body relaxed in that deep kind of rest that only came when someone felt completely safe. The plane waited for clearance, then began its takeoff roll, engines screaming as they accelerated down the runway until Reynolds pulled back on the controls and lifted the Boeing 737 smoothly into the Colorado morning. The landing gear retracted with a solid thunk, and the plane began climbing toward its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet that would carry them across the Great Plains to Chicago. 20 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign chimed off and Jessica and Marcus began their beverage service, moving slowly down the aisle with their cart and asking passengers what they would like to drink. When they reached row 8, they saw that the woman in the window seat was still sleeping soundly, her face peaceful and relaxed, showing no signs of waking anytime soon. Jessica smiled at the businessman next to her and whispered that they would skip his row mate unless he wanted to wake her, but he shook his head quickly and said to let her sleep because she obviously needed it. They moved on, leaving Sarah undisturbed in her little bubble of rest while the plane continued climbing through perfectly clear skies, the Rocky Mountains falling away behind them as they headed east. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds and First Officer Park were discussing baseball when Reynolds suddenly felt an uncomfortable pressure in his chest. He paused mid-sentence, his hand moving instinctively to press against his sternum, trying to understand what was happening. Park noticed immediately and asked if everything was okay, but Reynolds waved him off casually, saying it was probably just indigestion from the breakfast sandwich he had grabbed at the airport before their flight. He had experienced this kind of discomfort before, that heavy feeling that came from eating too fast or choosing greasy food, and it always passed within a few minutes. He took a deep breath and tried to focus on the instrument panel in front of him, but the pressure in his chest was not fading like usual. Instead, it was getting stronger, spreading across his entire ribcage like an iron band being tightened around his chest. Below them, the landscape looked peaceful and calm, endless fields of brown and green stretching to every horizon under the morning sun. The aircraft was flying smoothly on autopilot with all systems functioning perfectly. In the cabin, passengers were reading, watching movies on their tablets, or dozing in their seats. A child somewhere in the back laughed at something funny, and a businessman in first class was typing rapidly on his laptop, racing to finish a presentation before landing. Nobody had any idea that in the cockpit, Captain Reynolds was experiencing the first symptoms of a massive heart attack that was about to turn this routine flight into a desperate emergency requiring skills and knowledge that almost nobody on board possessed. The pain exploded across Reynolds's chest like a bomb going off inside his ribcage, so intense and sudden that he gasped and leaned forward in his seat, unable to speak or even breathe properly. His left arm went completely numb, tingling with pins and needles that radiated from his shoulder all the way down to his fingertips. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool temperature maintained in the cockpit, and his vision started to blur and darken at the edges as his brain struggled to process what was happening to his body. First Officer Park saw the captain's face turn pale gray and knew instantly that this was not indigestion or a minor problem. This was a medical emergency happening right now at 35,000 feet with 247 passengers depending on them to keep the plane safe. Reynolds tried to say something but could only manage a weak choking sound as the crushing pain in his chest intensified beyond anything he had ever experienced. His hands fell away from the controls and he slumped sideways in his seat, held upright only by his shoulder harness and seatbelt, his head rolling forward as consciousness started to slip away. Park felt his own heart hammering with fear as he reached across to check Reynolds's pulse, finding it rapid and irregular, the captain's skin cold and clammy to the touch. Park's extensive emergency training kicked in automatically as he pressed the call button for the flight attendants with one hand while grabbing the radio with the other to declare a medical emergency to air traffic control. His voice came out steady and professional despite the terror racing through his mind, because he needed help and he needed it immediately. Jessica was in the galley preparing drinks when she heard the urgent buzzer from the cockpit, a sound that always meant something had gone very wrong. She had been a flight attendant for 9 years and had dealt with passenger medical emergencies before, sick children and elderly people having strokes and even one man who died of a heart attack in his seat, but a pilot having a medical emergency was completely different and infinitely more terrifying. She rushed to the cockpit door and used the special knock pattern that signaled crew emergency, hearing the lock click open immediately. When she stepped inside the cockpit, her stomach dropped at what she saw. Captain Reynolds was collapsed in his seat, his face ashen and covered with sweat, his breathing shallow and labored like he was drowning. First Officer Park was trying to maintain control of the aircraft while simultaneously reaching over to help Reynolds, but it was impossible to do both jobs effectively at the same time. Marcus appeared behind Jessica carrying the aircraft's emergency medical kit, a large red bag containing oxygen, medications, and basic life-saving equipment that all commercial planes carried for exactly this kind of nightmare scenario. Jessica immediately began checking Reynolds's vital signs while Marcus struggled to set up the portable oxygen tank in the cramped cockpit space and get the mask positioned over the captain's face. Reynolds's pulse was weak and thready, barely detectable under her fingers, and his blood pressure was dangerously low based on his symptoms. His body was showing all the classic signs of a major cardiac event that required immediate hospital care, the kind of care that could only be provided on the ground in a proper emergency room. But they were 7 miles above the Earth traveling at 500 miles per hour, and the nearest airport was still hundreds of miles away across empty farmland. Park was already coordinating with air traffic control to find the closest suitable airport for an emergency landing, his voice calm and professional as he explained the situation and requested priority handling. Air traffic control immediately began clearing a path for them and identifying the nearest airports with long enough runways and medical facilities capable of handling a cardiac emergency. The closest option was Omaha, Nebraska, about 200 miles ahead, maybe 25 or 30 minutes away even if they started descending at maximum safe speed right now. Park knew that every second counted when someone was having a heart attack, that brain damage started happening within minutes if the heart stopped pumping oxygenated blood, but he also knew he could not just point the nose down and dive for the ground because that would endanger everyone else on board. Jessica looked at First Officer Park and saw the strain on his young face as he tried to manage emergency descent planning, coordinate with air traffic control, monitor all the aircraft systems, and worry about his dying captain all at the same time. She understood that Park was fully qualified to land the plane by himself, that co-pilots were trained for exactly this scenario, but trying to manage a medical emergency while flying single pilot made everything exponentially more difficult and dangerous. Park glanced at her with desperation in his eyes and asked if there was anyone on the flight with medical training, maybe a doctor or nurse or paramedic who could take over caring for Reynolds so he could focus entirely on flying the aircraft and getting everyone safely on the ground. Jessica nodded and rushed back into the cabin, her hands shaking as she grabbed the public address microphone. Her voice came over the speakers throughout the cabin, interrupting movies and conversations and jolting awake passengers who had been dozing. She tried to keep her tone calm and professional, but everyone could hear the barely controlled panic underneath her words as she made an urgent announcement. She asked if there was a doctor or nurse on board, or anyone with emergency medical training, and could they please identify themselves immediately to the flight crew because they had a medical emergency that required immediate assistance. Several hands went up throughout the cabin. A cardiologist sitting in first class immediately unbuckled his seatbelt and started moving toward the front. A paramedic in row 15 raised his hand high and grabbed his emergency credential card to show the flight attendants. And in row 8, Sarah Mitchell's eyes snapped open at the sound of Jessica's stressed voice, her pilot's brain immediately processing the tone and understanding that something had gone terribly wrong. Sarah sat up straight in her seat, pulling off her blanket and neck pillow, her mind shifting from deep sleep to complete alertness with the kind of speed that only came from years of emergency training and real-world crisis experience. She heard Jessica's voice come over the speakers again, even more strained now, asking a follow-up question that made Sarah's blood run cold. Jessica was asking specifically if anyone on board had aviation experience, any kind of pilot training or flying background at all, because they had an emergency in the cockpit and desperately needed assistance immediately. The businessmen sitting next to Sarah looked confused, wondering why they would need a pilot when presumably the plane already had pilots flying it, but Sarah understood exactly what that announcement meant. One of the pilots was incapacitated, and the remaining pilot needed help that went far beyond basic medical care. Sarah reached up and pressed her call button, and when Marcus rushed over to her row she spoke quickly and clearly, identifying herself as a commercial airline captain with over 20,000 hours of flight time, current type rating on the Boeing 737, and extensive emergency procedure training including single-pilot operations and medical crisis management. Marcus stared at her with wide eyes, his mouth falling open in shock and relief as he tried to process what he was hearing. This woman who had been sleeping so peacefully just minutes ago, who they had tiptoed past to avoid disturbing, was apparently one of the most qualified pilots who could possibly be on this aircraft. He asked to see some kind of proof and Sarah quickly pulled her airline ID badge from her purse, showing him her captain's license and current medical certification that proved she was exactly who she said she was. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm, probably more roughly than he intended in his panic, and pulled her out of her seat toward the front of the aircraft. He was calling to Jessica that they had found a pilot, an actual captain who could help them, his voice cracking with emotion and relief. Other passengers watched with confused expressions as the sleeping woman from row 8 was rushed toward the cockpit, most of them still not understanding what was happening or why a passenger was being taken to see the pilots. Sarah moved quickly through the cabin, her mind already racing through emergency procedures and protocols, mentally preparing herself for whatever situation she was about to face in the cockpit. The cardiologist had already reached the cockpit ahead of her and was trying to provide medical care to Captain Reynolds in the impossibly cramped space, attempting to perform chest compressions on the unconscious pilot while Marcus held the oxygen mask in place over his face. Sarah stepped through the cockpit door and took in the entire scene with the practiced eye of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of nightmare scenario dozens of times in flight simulators. She saw First Officer Park in the right seat with his hands moving rapidly across the controls and his headset pressed tight to his ear as he communicated with air traffic control. She saw Captain Reynolds slumped in the left seat with the doctor performing CPR compressions in the tiny space available. She saw the instrument panels showing they were still at cruise altitude but beginning a descent, and she immediately understood what needed to happen next and how critical the next few minutes were going to be. First Officer Park looked up and saw Sarah standing in the cockpit doorway with her airline ID badge visible, and the wave of relief that washed over him was so powerful it almost made him dizzy. He asked her to quickly confirm her qualifications, needing to know exactly what kind of help he was getting, and Sarah gave him a rapid 30-second summary that hit all the key points. Current Boeing 737 type rating, instructor pilot status, over 8,000 hours flying this exact aircraft model, extensive training in emergency procedures including single-pilot operations and in-flight medical emergencies. Park nodded quickly and asked her to take the captain's seat so he could focus on coordinating their emergency landing while she handled the actual flying of the aircraft. They needed to work together as a professional crew to get everyone on this plane safely on the ground, and having an experienced captain in the other seat changed everything about their chances of success. Sarah slid into the captain's seat as the cardiologist and Marcus carefully extracted Reynolds from his harness and laid him flat on the cockpit floor where there was slightly more room to perform effective CPR. The doctor continued his compressions, counting out loud to maintain the right rhythm, while Sarah's hands moved across the familiar controls with automatic precision born from thousands of hours sitting in this exact seat. She quickly scanned the instruments to build a mental picture of their current situation, checking altitude, heading, airspeed, fuel status, weather conditions, and aircraft systems. Park briefed her rapidly on everything that had happened, where they were located, and that air traffic control had cleared them for emergency priority handling direct to Omaha Epley Airfield, the nearest suitable airport about 200 miles ahead. Sarah acknowledged the briefing and immediately began working with Park to configure the aircraft for rapid emergency descent. They needed to get down from 35,000 feet to landing altitude as quickly as safely possible, which meant using emergency descent procedures that would drop them at over 4,000 feet per minute while keeping the aircraft stable and all the passengers safe in the cabin. Sarah had practiced this exact procedure hundreds of times in simulators, had taught it to countless student pilots who thought they understood emergency descents until Sarah showed them what a real emergency looked like, and now she was executing it in real life with 247 people depending on her skill and experience. She extended the speed brakes to increase drag and slow their forward speed, reduced power on both engines to flight idle, and lowered the nose into a descent angle that felt steep but was well within the aircraft's safe operating limits. Behind them in the cabin, passengers suddenly felt the plane pitch forward and begin dropping rapidly toward the ground far below. Some people gasped in surprise and fear, others grabbed their armrests with white knuckles, and nervous whispers spread quickly through the rows as people wondered what was happening and whether they should be terrified. Jessica got back on the public address system and explained in her most reassuring voice that they were experiencing a medical emergency and making an unscheduled landing in Omaha, that everyone should remain seated with their seatbelts fastened tightly, and that the pilots had everything under control and would have them safely on the ground very soon. She carefully did not mention that one of the pilots was currently receiving CPR on the cockpit floor or that the woman who had been sleeping peacefully in row 8 was now flying the airplane, because that information would not help anyone stay calm. Sarah and Park worked together with smooth coordination that would have impressed anyone watching, functioning like a crew that had flown together for years even though they had met less than 5 minutes ago. Park handled all radio communications with air traffic control and coordinated with Omaha Tower to have emergency medical services standing by on the runway ready to rush Captain Reynolds to the hospital the instant they landed. Sarah flew the aircraft, managing their descent profile, constantly monitoring all the systems, making continuous small adjustments to keep them on the optimal path to the airport. They talked constantly, sharing information back and forth, double-checking each other's decisions, maintaining the kind of clear professional communication that was the absolute foundation of safe flight operations during emergencies. Sarah's voice remained steady and calm, showing no hint of the adrenaline flooding her system or the crushing weight of responsibility she felt for all the lives depending on her ability to do this perfectly. The cardiologist working on Captain Reynolds looked up briefly from his chest compressions and reported that he had managed to restore a weak pulse, but it was unstable and irregular and could stop again at any moment. Reynolds desperately needed to be in a proper hospital within the next few minutes or he was not going to survive this heart attack. Sarah acknowledged the information and pushed their descent rate slightly higher, taking the aircraft right to the edge of the safe envelope but not beyond it, using every bit of her extensive experience to find the perfect balance between speed and safety. The ground was rushing up toward them as they dropped through 20,000 feet, then 15,000 feet, the farmland of Nebraska spreading out below them in neat geometric patterns that looked almost artificial from this altitude. Park was on the radio with Omaha approach control, receiving vectors that would guide them straight to the runway without any of the usual complicated arrival procedures that normally added time and distance to their approach. The air traffic controllers knew they had a critical emergency inbound and had cleared all other traffic out of their path, giving Sarah and Park a direct line to the airport with absolute priority over everything else in the sky. Sarah called for the approach checklist and Park ran through it with practiced efficiency, configuring the aircraft for landing by extending the flaps in stages, lowering the landing gear, and setting the appropriate speeds for their current weight and configuration. Every single action had to be precise and executed in exactly the correct sequence, and both pilots performed their duties with the kind of intense focused concentration that made commercial aviation as safe as it was. They broke through 10,000 feet and Sarah could see Omaha in the distance, the city's buildings catching the morning sunlight and the airport visible as a dark patch with long runways extending in different directions. The airport was almost straight ahead, maybe 15 miles away now, and she began making fine adjustments to their descent rate to intercept the invisible glide slope that would guide them down to the runway at exactly the right angle. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced ease, making tiny corrections to their flight path, maintaining precisely the right speed and descent angle. Park called out altitude checkpoints as they passed through each 1,000-foot increment, giving Sarah constant feedback about their progress. 5,000 feet, 4,000 feet, 3,000 feet, and the runway was growing larger in the windscreen ahead of them, a long concrete strip that represented safety and medical care and survival for Captain Reynolds. Behind them in the cabin, Jessica and Marcus were rapidly preparing for emergency landing, moving through the aisles and making absolutely certain that every passenger had their seatbelt pulled tight, their tray table stowed and locked, and their seat in a full upright position. They moved quickly but with forced smiles, trying to reassure nervous passengers that everything was under control, that they would be safely on the ground very soon and this would all be over. Some passengers were praying quietly with their eyes closed, others were frantically texting loved ones goodbye messages in case something went wrong, and more than a few were crying silently as they watched the ground getting closer through their windows. The mother in row 7 held her 2 children close and whispered that everything was going to be okay, while the businessman next to Sarah's empty seat stared at the vacant spot and wondered who that sleeping woman had been and where she had gone. Sarah called for the final landing checklist and Park confirmed that everything was properly set and ready. Landing gear down and locked with 3 green indicator lights, flaps extended to full landing position, speed brakes armed and ready to deploy on touchdown, automatic brakes set to maximum to help them stop as quickly as possible. They were 2 miles from the runway now, perfectly aligned with the centerline, descending at exactly the right rate to touch down in the first 1,000 feet of available runway. Sarah could see emergency vehicles lining both sides of the runway, fire trucks and ambulances with their lights flashing brightly, ready to respond instantly to whatever happened when they landed. She pushed those thoughts completely out of her mind and focused entirely on the landing, on making this approach as smooth and precise as any she had ever flown in her entire career, because slamming the aircraft onto the runway would not help Captain Reynolds or anyone else. 1,000 feet above the ground and Sarah began the landing flare, gradually pulling back on the controls to arrest their descent and transition smoothly from flying to landing. The runway numbers flashed beneath them and she held the plane just a few feet above the concrete, letting their speed bleed off naturally, waiting for exactly the perfect moment to let the wheels kiss the runway. The main landing gear touched down with barely a bump, one of the smoothest landings Sarah had ever made under emergency conditions, and she immediately deployed the thrust reversers to help slow the aircraft while keeping it perfectly centered on the runway. Park called out their decreasing speed as they rolled down the runway with emergency vehicles racing alongside them keeping pace, and when they finally came to a complete stop Sarah set the parking brake and began the engine shutdown procedure. Before the engines had even finished spooling down, paramedics were already rushing up the mobile stairs that ground crew had wheeled to the forward door. They burst into the cockpit with a stretcher and advanced medical equipment, immediately taking over care of Captain Reynolds from the exhausted cardiologist who had been performing continuous CPR for almost 30 minutes straight. The paramedics worked with incredible speed and efficiency, loading Reynolds onto the stretcher while simultaneously hooking him up to portable monitors and starting intravenous lines. Within 90 seconds they had him off the aircraft and were racing toward the waiting ambulance, its siren already wailing as it accelerated toward the hospital with Reynolds fighting for his life inside. Sarah sat in the captain's seat with her hands still resting on the controls, feeling the post-adrenaline shakes beginning to hit her system now that the immediate emergency was over and everyone was safe. Park reached across and firmly shook her hand, his eyes bright with unshed tears of relief and gratitude, telling her that she had just saved everyone on this aircraft including Captain Reynolds if the paramedics could keep him alive until they got him into surgery. Sarah nodded quietly, still processing everything that had just happened, how she had gone from sleeping peacefully in row 8 to landing a crippled flight in full emergency conditions, how every single thing she had learned and practiced over 22 years had come together in those crucial 30 minutes. Passengers began deplaning down the emergency stairs into the bright Nebraska sunshine, many of them visibly shaken and pale, some crying openly with relief at being safely on the ground, others angry and frustrated that their travel plans had been so dramatically interrupted. Most of them never learned that the woman who had quite literally saved all their lives had been sleeping quietly in row 8 just an hour earlier, that she had been completely invisible to them, just another anonymous tired passenger trying to catch some rest during a routine flight. But Jessica and Marcus knew the truth, and they stood at the aircraft door thanking each departing passenger while their eyes kept drifting back to Sarah still sitting in the cockpit, this completely ordinary-looking woman who had turned out to be anything but ordinary when the situation demanded extraordinary skill and courage. The airline's local station manager came aboard to check on the crew and begin coordinating the massive logistical challenge of getting all these passengers to their final destinations. When he heard the complete story from First Officer Park about how a sleeping passenger in row 8 had turned out to be a senior captain with exactly the right experience and training to handle this precise emergency, he just shook his head in pure amazement at the incredible coincidence. He asked Sarah how she happened to be on this particular flight at this particular moment, and Sarah gave him a tired smile and explained that she had been visiting family in Denver and just wanted a quiet peaceful ride home to Chicago. The station manager actually laughed out loud and said that was probably the least quiet and least peaceful ride home that anyone had ever experienced in the history of commercial aviation. News crews were already setting up their cameras outside the airport terminal, having monitored the emergency on their police scanners and smelling a dramatic story about the hero pilot who had saved Flight 447. Reporters desperately wanted to interview Sarah, to put her on camera and hear her describe the harrowing experience, but she quietly declined all interview requests. She insisted that she had only done what any properly qualified pilot would have done in the exact same situation, that the real credit belonged to First Officer Park for managing the initial emergency so professionally and to the cardiologist who had kept Captain Reynolds alive long enough to reach proper medical care. Sarah genuinely did not want attention or recognition or praise, she just wanted to know whether Captain Reynolds was going to survive and when she could finally get home to Chicago and her normal quiet life. The airline arranged hotel rooms for all the displaced passengers and rebooked them on flights departing the next morning. Sarah ended up spending several hours in a windowless conference room at the airport being extensively debriefed by airline safety officials and FAA investigators who needed to document every single detail of the emergency for their official reports. She walked them methodically through the entire sequence of events, from the exact moment she woke up to Jessica's urgent announcement all the way through to the final touchdown on Omaha's runway. The investigators listened carefully and took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific decisions she had made or technical procedures she had followed. They all agreed that her actions had been absolutely textbook perfect, exactly what should be done in that precise situation, and that her random presence on that particular flight had been extraordinarily fortunate for everyone involved. Word finally reached them late that afternoon that Captain Reynolds had survived the emergency surgery and was listed in critical but stable condition in the cardiac intensive care unit. The massive heart attack had caused significant permanent damage to his heart muscle, but the immediate CPR and quick transport to the hospital had kept him alive long enough for surgeons to perform emergency bypass surgery that saved his life. He would face many months of difficult recovery and rehabilitation, and he would almost certainly never be medically cleared to fly again, but he would live to see his grandchildren grow up and he would have the chance to personally thank all the people who had worked together to save his life. When Sarah heard this news she felt tears burning in her eyes, overwhelming relief washing over her that all her effort and skill and experience had resulted in the best possible outcome. The businessman who had been sitting quietly next to her in seat 8B gave a lengthy interview to a local television news station, describing in detail how the woman who ended up saving everyone on the flight had been sleeping so peacefully before the emergency that he had actually felt guilty about possibly disturbing her when he needed to squeeze past to use the lavatory. He said he had simply assumed she was probably exhausted from business travel, maybe a sales representative or consultant heading home after a long difficult week on the road. He admitted he never imagined for even a second that she might be a pilot, much less one of the most experienced and skilled captains in all of commercial aviation. The other passengers seated in rows 7 and 9 told similar stories to reporters, saying she had been completely unremarkable and forgettable, just another person trying to catch some desperately needed rest on an early morning flight. Sarah finally made it back home to Chicago 2 full days later on a regular scheduled commercial flight, sitting in first class as a professional courtesy from the airline's executive team. She watched the pilots execute a completely routine and uneventful takeoff and flight, observed them handling normal procedures with calm quiet professionalism, and found herself thinking about how 99.9% of all flights went exactly like this one, smooth and boring and perfectly safe from beginning to end. But she also thought deeply about that tiny remaining percentage, those extraordinarily rare moments when absolutely everything went catastrophically wrong and hundreds of lives suddenly depended on having exactly the right person in exactly the right place with exactly the right combination of skills and experience and training. She had been that right person for Flight 447, had been sleeping peacefully and invisibly in row 8 until the precise moment when the aircraft and everyone aboard needed her expertise and experience more than they needed anything else in the entire world. The airline presented Sarah with a formal commendation at a small private ceremony held the following month, honoring her exceptionally quick response and outstanding airmanship during the emergency. First Officer Park attended the ceremony, along with Jessica and Marcus and even the cardiologist who had performed CPR on Captain Reynolds. Reynolds himself also attended, moving slowly and carefully as he continued his recovery, but alive and deeply grateful to everyone who had worked together to save both him and all the passengers. He shook Sarah's hand warmly and told her he was permanently retiring from flying, but he would remember her and think about her every single day for the rest of his life as the sleeping passenger who woke up at exactly the moment she was needed most desperately. Sarah returned to her regular job as a senior flight instructor, continuing to teach emergency procedures and crisis management techniques to new pilots who would hopefully never need to use any of these skills in real life but who absolutely needed to know them anyway because aviation remained completely unforgiving of mistakes and poor decisions. She began telling her students the detailed story of Flight 447, about how she had been sleeping peacefully in row 8 and woke to face the worst possible emergency that could happen on a commercial flight. She used the story to illustrate the critical importance of staying absolutely current with all training requirements, of maintaining complete proficiency even during periods when you were not actively flying the line, of being mentally and physically ready to respond effectively when crisis struck without any warning whatsoever. Sometimes when Sarah traveled as a passenger on her days off, she would settle comfortably into her assigned seat and close her eyes for a nap during the flight, and other passengers walking past would see her and automatically assume she was just another exhausted traveler trying to catch up on desperately needed rest. Flight attendants would walk quietly and carefully past her seat to avoid disturbing her peaceful sleep. People sitting nearby would speak in hushed respectful tones out of basic courtesy. None of them would have any idea who she really was or what she had accomplished or what incredible skills and experience she was capable of deploying if another emergency suddenly required her unique combination of training and natural ability. She would simply be the sleeping woman in whatever row she happened to be occupying, completely invisible and utterly unremarkable until that rare critical moment when she was needed most. And that was exactly how Sarah Mitchell genuinely preferred things to be, to remain invisible and anonymous in the background, just another ordinary person quietly living her life, until that extraordinarily rare moment when her decades of training and hard-won experience could make the ultimate difference between life and death for people who did not even know she existed or was sitting among them. She had been sleeping peacefully in row 8 when Captain Reynolds's heart failed catastrophically at 35,000 feet, and she had awakened at precisely the moment when 247 people desperately needed her to be awake and alert and completely ready to save them all. That knowledge was enough recognition and reward for her, simply knowing that she had been there when it mattered most, that her skills had proven sufficient for the challenge, that everyone had gone home safely to their families because of the thousands of hours she had invested preparing for a moment she had sincerely hoped would never actually come.